So we're working on this Mark IV Super here. It got dropped off actually a couple months ago for a CD009 swap. And we were moving the car in and out one day and it just decided to die just out of nowhere. Like would not start back up, has no RPM signal. It's on an AEM Infinity, but unfortunately the car doesn't start. So I've already checked the easy stuff, which is the sensor itself, and then now I've got to go through all the wiring. The fun part is that I have to go through to do this wiring while the car is on the lift. Yay. So we're working on this Mark IV Supra with a 2JZ GTE non-VVTi motor, and this car has a crank no start condition. So it has a custom wiring harness and an AEM Infinity 506 box. So I've already done the first initial testing, which was actually the crank position sensor itself. To get to that, you have to remove the alternator. So you just remove the alternator real quick, and then there's a 10 mil bolt underneath. I pulled it out to check two things. First and foremost, I checked the ohm reading on it. So the ohm reading was within 1 k ohm. So that's well within what the factory specifies it at. The factory specs, it's like basically 985 ohm all the way up to 1600 ohm. So this tested right at 1000 ohm basically. And then the second thing, the reason why the sensor actually had to come out was to check the trigger wheel itself. So the trigger wheels on the 2Js are actually known for coming apart. So it's a two-piece, one, the gear that holds the belt, and then you've got the actual trigger teeth in the back. And the welds are known for just coming apart, and then what will happen is even though the motor cranks, the trigger wheel is just sitting in one spot, so the ECU doesn't read RPM. Tested the wiring from the harness, so this is the harness here, and I've checked for continuity all the way in to the AEM box there. So pins C17 and C18 are the crankshaft position sensor. It's a VR sensor, so there's only two wires, and they go to their respective spots. There's no real resistance. There's a little bit of resistance, obviously, but nothing crazy. So that tells me it's got a good connection, and continuity tested out good. So now the next step is we're actually going to check the cam angle sensors. So on the cam angle sensors on the 2J, there's actually two of them, but when you go standalone, you only use one. So this is what's considered the front one, and then this is the rear one. So it doesn't really matter which one you run. The only thing that really changes is your firing order, basically. I mean, there's a couple other things that changes as well, but essentially the only thing that changes is your firing order. I've already removed the sensor. I haven't tested it yet, or I haven't ohmed it out yet, but the sensor does have oil on it. And here's the connector, obviously. So since I do already have the AEM unplugged, I'm going to go ahead and check continuity on these two wires into the AEM. So I've got the other end of my multimeter into the actual AEM, and when I pin it in here, it's got continuity. So now we're just going to test the other side, and I'm going to run it in there and swap the pins really quick, and if we've got good continuity, you'll hear it beep. All right, so as you guys can hear that the meter is beeping, so we've got continuity there. I'm gonna take a look off camera here real quick and check the ohm reading on it. And it's 0.4, so the ohm reading is actually pretty low. So I would say at this point the wiring is good. So the only thing I have to check now is the actual camshaft sensor really quick. So I couldn't do it. Obviously I need two hands, but I ohmed this out and it ohmed within spec. So it basically was a little over 1100 ohms, which is well within spec. The spec is 835 to 1600. So this falls within spec. So and the wiring is good. So we've checked all four pins from the AEM to the harness to the connectors, and the crankshaft sensor and the cam angle sensor both test good. So unfortunately, the only thing that, I hate to say it, is the only thing that's really left is the AEM itself is bad. I mean, the chances of that I think are pretty slim, but we will have to go in and troubleshoot it. So right now we're waiting on the battery to get back from O'Reilly's because the battery was flat. once we get the battery in, we'll throw it back in the car, and then we'll test it again and see. What I'm going to do though is, I believe the sensors are actually the same between the front and the rear. I'm just going to move the rear one to the front. I've already replaced the crankshaft sensor just to see if that would do the trick, and it obviously did not. So we'll go ahead and we'll just swap this over. So generally speaking, on a standalone ECU though, crankshaft is really the only indicator of RPM. So it uses the cam sensor for what's called cam sync, basically, to tell the motor where it's TDC. But usually, like I said, even with the camshaft sensor, and take this with a grain of salt, I'm not super familiar with the AEM stuff, but generally on most standalone ECUs, when you go to crank it, it looks at RPM first via the crank sensor, and then when it actually synchronizes it, when it sees the camshaft sensor. So I'm assuming that the AEM here is no different than that, but because we already have the sensor, we don't have to spend any money on it, and then we'll just go ahead and switch it from front to back. All right, so we've got the ECU hooked up. As you can see, the map sensor is doing something. You can see throttle moving. We're gonna go to crank it, and no engine RPM still.